Our key concept is continued from last lecture. The American Revolution's democratic and republican ideals inspired new experiments with different forms of government. So today we're actually going to talk about the first big government run by an executive in the United States. So our argument is new forms of national culture and political institutions developed in the U.S. alongside continued regional variations, or we'll call it sectionalism, and differences over economic, political, social, and foreign policy issues. During the presidential administrations of our first two presidents, George Washington and John Adams, political leaders created institutions and precedents that put the principles of the Constitution into practice. Precedents, just a reminder, are like examples or models for how people do stuff in the future. So the first example are the executive branch departments. Washington created the executive branch departments, and he avoided making appointments of department heads based on social standings or friendship. He gave people secretary of department positions based on qualifications and merit. He advanced promising young men like Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, and these were both seen as very selfless decisions because both men disagreed with Washington at different points in time. However, Washington understood his own limitations, and he listened to the counsel of his cabinet, and he set the example for how a president should do that in the future. The first state executive departments were State, War, Treasury, and Attorney General, and these were, again, created under Washington. The Secretary of the Navy was added under John Adams, who was our second president. So the Naval Department was added to the State, War, Treasury, and Attorney General. The Judiciary Act of 1789 is another example of these new principles and precedents. The Judiciary Act was supported by Article 3 of the Constitution, which established the Supreme Court, but the Constitution left Congress the power to create lower federal courts if necessary. The Judiciary Act was written by a Connecticut senator, and it established the structure and jurisdiction of the federal court system. It also created an executive position of Attorney General, who later became part of the cabinet. The next point that I want to make is that political leaders in the 1790s took a variety of positions on issues, such as the relationship between the national government and the states, economic policy, foreign policy, and the balance between liberty and order. This leads to the formation of two political parties, most significantly the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, and the Democratic Republican Party, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. So the first thing I want to talk about is a Federalist idea. Alexander Hamilton came up with a financial plan and a way to create a Bank of the United States. At 32 years old, Hamilton's plan was to resolve the overwhelming U.S. debt left in the United States after the Revolutionary War. Hamilton proposed that the federal government would assume the entire debt of the states and that the states' obligations to pay that debt would be forgiven. The federal government would borrow money at a lower interest rate. Maryland, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Virginia saw no reason to pay taxes to the federal government, however, because they had already paid off their debts. Okay? They were mad that the other states were not going to have to pay their debts. There was a huge debate in Congress when Hamilton proposed this plan. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson compromised with Hamilton. They said, if you implement your financial plan and build a Bank of the United States, the capital of the United States will move to the south. And so they actually planned a spot at the Potomac River in Washington, D.C., where the capital is now. The next step of the plan was to create a Bank of the United States. It was modeled after the Bank of England. The National Bank would collect taxes, they would hold government funds, they would provide loans to the government and to other borrowers. The opposition to this was that it was un-Republican. It encouraged speculation and corruption. There were people who were strict constitutionists. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, they said the bank was unconstitutional since the Constitution did not give Congress the specific power to create the Bank of the United States. But Alexander Hamilton argued that it was an implied power. In the Constitution, there's a necessary and proper clause, and that Congress would have the power to create the Bank of the U.S. under this necessary and proper clause. The president signed the law to create the bank. The final step of Hamilton's financial plan was to help national industries or factories by passing high tariffs, taxes on imported goods, to protect U.S. businesses from foreign industries. This passed government subsidies, government financed transportation improvements, and the goal was to break Britain's manufacturing hold on America. Thomas Jefferson opposed this because he thought manufacturing would compete with the agrarian way of life, or farming. Hamilton wins. He actually gets to create the Bank of the U.S. and implement his three-step financial plan, but a new political party started based on Thomas Jefferson's vision of a nation of farmers with more freedom. The next thing we'll talk about is the elastic clause, which I've already alluded to. Congress has the power to make laws that are necessary and proper. This is also known as the necessary and proper clause for the functioning of the United States. This is not a do whatever we want clause. It's found in Article 1, Section 8. It's elastic like a rubber band. If you loosely interpret the Constitution, this would allow Congress to create things like a national bank, civil rights acts, and change as times change in America. The Federalists were loose interpretation believers. Strict interpreters of the Constitution, this was an idea shared by many anti-federalists, said if the Constitution does not directly give Congress power to do something, they can't do it. Even like making banks or protecting minority groups. If it doesn't say that Congress can do it, they can't do it. And people who believed this fell into the party of Democratic Republicans for the most part. We also see the formation of these two political parties. The definition of a political party is a group of people who organize to support certain public policies. The goal of a party is to get certain officials who support these goals elected. American Revolution leaders did not support the idea of political parties. George Washington actually warns against forming factions or parties in his farewell address in 1796. Thomas Jefferson agreed, but he eventually became the founder of one of the first two parties, the Democratic Republicans. The first political party in the U.S. were the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton and others who wanted a strong national government. They were formed in 1787. Northern businessmen, merchants, bankers, who all believed that capitalism and industry were the basis of a healthy republic, and that capitalism and industry should be protected by the strong federal government, including implementing high tariffs to support young industries. They were all part of this Federalist Party. They also, in foreign policy, tended to side with England in conflicts rather than France. In 1796, a new group called the Democratic Republicans were formed from a group who were formerly known as anti-federalists, who gathered around their leader, Thomas Jefferson. Democratic Republicans were formed by planters, small farmers, and artisans. They wanted to limit federal government's powers, keep the power in the hands of the state and local governments. They wanted government to leave them alone. In terms of foreign policy, they sympathized with the revolutionary French over England. And the last example here are the Alien and Sedition Acts. These were a series of laws passed by the Federalist Congress in 1789. They were signed into law by President John Adams. These were new powers to deport foreigners. It made it harder for new immigrants to vote. You had to live in the U.S. for 14 years. It was raised from 5 years in order to vote. Foreigners were seen as a deep threat to U.S. security. These acts permitted strong government control over individual actions. Specifically, the Sedition Act promoted this. These acts prohibited public opposition to the government, and that violates potentially the First Amendment. You were fined or imprisoned if you wrote, printed, or uttered or published any false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government. They did not have any power of judicial review to challenge the law yet, so these acts went largely unchecked. Finally, we see the expansion of slavery in the Deep South in the adjacent Western lands as farmers spread west, and rising anti-slavery sentiment began to create distinctive regional attitudes towards the institution of slavery. So people started to disagree on whether we should have slavery or not have slavery after the Revolutionary War. Anti-slavery societies formed. The first one was known as the American Anti-Slavery Society. It existed from 1833 to 1870. It promoted the immediate abolition of slavery in the U.S., and there were state and local auxiliaries. This was the main activist group that led the abolition movement, and the American Anti-Slavery Society was led by a man named William Lloyd Garrison, who we'll talk about a lot later. By 1840, their total membership ranged from 150,000 to 200,000 members. Societies organized support, signed anti-slavery petitions, and sent them to Congress. They published journals. They printed and distributed propaganda to carry out anti-slavery messages to people in the North. Most participants were from religious circles or free Black communities. There were public meetings that featured testimonies from former slaves like Frederick Douglass, and there was frequent violent opposition that occurred when mobs would burn the presses of the anti-slavery societies. They would attack the speakers at the meetings, and they would invade the meetings to try to get the anti-slavery message to stop. There was also limited rights for free Blacks in America. Free Black Americans lived throughout the country well before the Civil War. By 1860, 1.5 million free Black Americans lived in southern states. And they could become free in many different ways. They could buy freedom from their owners, which was rare by the mid-1850s. There was also a thing called manumission, which means voluntary emancipation of a slave by the owner. A lot of times, if you were the offspring of an interracial relationship between the owner and someone who was enslaved, you were often set free. Some slaves were freed as the abolitionist movement grew, and people were turned to see that slavery was not going to last, and so they freed their slaves after a certain amount of years. Many people became free through escape. A few African Americans who actually immigrated to the United States, they never were enslaved at all, especially in the New Orleans area. A Virginia law in the 1830s prohibited teaching all Black Americans to read or write. In the South, free Black Americans were banned from possessing firearms or preaching the Bible. Later laws prohibited free Black Americans who left the state to be educated, who left the state to be educated from returning to that original state. There were many different slave codes. These are all examples of slave codes. They were applied to free people of color in many states as well. Free Black Americans couldn't testify in court. If a slave catcher caught you and claimed that you who were free were actually a slave, you can't defend yourself in court. So that was another huge issue. Okay. Last thing we'll talk about is that ideas about national identity found expression in works of art, literature, and architecture. So 3 things. First of all, there's a painter. His name is John Trumbull. In the late 18th century, early 19th century, a painter, John Trumbull, known for his paintings, celebrated the American Revolution events. In 1817, he was commissioned by Congress to paint 4 large pictures for the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. The 4 included George Washington, the surrender of Cornwallis and Burgoyne at the end of the war, and the Declaration of Independence. And here's another one. This is the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Another thing that was created is the U.S. flag and the growth of nationalism. In June of 1777, the Continental Congress passed an act that established the official flag for the new nations. There would be 13 stripes, red and white, representing the colonies, the Union, 13 stars, white in blue field, and that represents a new constellation. Now there are 50 stars for 50 states. Originally, again, there were 13 states, so 13 stars. This flag unified the new states under one government, and it was one symbol, and from that we see the growth of nationalism. And finally, we have a woman named Mercy Otis Warren, who was a political writer and propagandist of the American Revolution. She is a female historian in a male-dominated field. She wrote a book called The History of the American Revolution. She was an activist in patriot activities before the war, and this is the first history of the American Revolution authored by a woman, celebrating the American revolutionary feats. So if you guys have any questions, let me know. But this is the end of this key concept.